Okay, welcome to your final lecture for the unit. Actually, I take that back. It's not your final lecture for the unit. It's your second to last lecture for the unit. Well, today we're going to be covering information relating to pages 351 to 359 of your textbook. It's always a good idea to read your textbook, look at the pictures, and read the charts and captions to help get a sense or feel for the topics. However, this lecture is intended to help you fill in the gaps and get a more visual sense of the material as well. In class, we've learned about the components that make up a totalitarian government. We know that totalitarian leaders have complete or total control over their people's lives. There are many totalitarian regimes in today's world, many of which we will be covering this year in Global 9. China established a communist totalitarian regime in 1949 under a leader named Mao Zedong. Following the defeat of the democratic nationalist regime led by Chiang Kai-shek, Mao will take over. Now we know that Chiang Kai-shek is also known by the name Jiang Jieshi. Just saying. All right, well, we've already established the components of a totalitarian form of government, or at least gone through these in class. I've also explained in class that there are a variety of ways to implement a totalitarian government regime. A key point I want you all to remember is that not all totalitarian regimes are communist. Case in point, totalitarianism in fascist Nazi Germany during the 1930s and leading up through World War II until 1945. Fascists and communists are different in so many ways, but more on that later. For now, write down that not all totalitarian regimes are communist, okay? Mao Zedong once said, quote, "A revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle. A revolution is an act of violence by which one class overthrows another." This quote indicates that Mao felt that revolutions had to be violent inherently. What are revolutions? Well, a revolution simply means a monumental change in society. So clearly Mao felt that monumental changes are often accompanied by violence. Most revolutions in history have, in fact, been violent in some way. So why did the communists win the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949 and establish a communist totalitarian regime? Well, we're going to talk about that today. All right, well, the communist victory, here we go. Why? And what's the appeal of communism? You know, I believe that all revolutions display some fundamental patterns. I use the acronym GENOS, G-E-N-O-S, to explain these to my 10th graders. So write these down, and I will explain each letter of the acronym. All revolutions are caused by the GENOS phenomenon, G-E-N-O-S, GENOS. So what does that stand for? Well, the G stands for government problems. Okay, so write that down. The E stands for economic problems. The N stands for nationalism and new social ideas or philosophies. And the O stands for other revolutions elsewhere or ongoing revolutions. And the final letter, S, stands for social inequality. China went through the GENOS phenomenon, and here's how. 1. Government problems. After thousands of years of dynastic rule, European imperialism, and the establishment of democratic regimes under Sun Yat-sen and then Chiang Kai-shek, the democratic regime was not meeting the needs of most of the people. Most people lived in poverty and did not enjoy a high standard of living. Meanwhile, many government officials under the democratic regimes were corrupt and self-interested. These people lived the good life while millions suffered. Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang or nationalists simply were not meeting the needs of most of their people. They were perceived as greedy, self-interested, and were viewed as having allowed foreign interests dominate China. All right, the second, E, economic problems. The fact of the matter was that most Chinese never experienced prosperity under the nationalist regime. Those living in the cities and business owners enjoyed a much higher standard of living. Many of the Chinese felt this was fundamentally unfair to have such differences between the rich and the poor. We've already learned that poor people are more likely to support communism because of its focus on economic equality and the redistribution of wealth. Well, most Chinese people were more than happy to support Mao because of the promise of a better economic outlook for the poor. All right, 3. Nationalism and new social ideas. Chinese people were highly nationalistic at the time and were tired of foreign influence in their nation. New ideas like communism and self-sufficiency rapidly spread throughout the nation. All of these contributed to the eventual overthrow of the nationalist regime. Other revolutions. Oh, did you know that the Soviet Union was a communist totalitarian nation established by Vladimir Lenin starting in, 1970 through the 1920s? Following Lenin's death, a leader named Joseph Stalin took over and led the USSR from around 1923 until the early 1950s. The USSR had formerly been called the Russian Empire and had been led by a special type of king called a Tsar. You're going to learn all about this in 10th grade, so don't fret. Well, the people in Russia, led first by Lenin, overthrew their government during a period of time that you'll study as 10th graders called the Russian Revolution. After a temporary interim government that was democratic, Lenin took over and established a communist state by promising his people a number of things. This is very similar to the events in China. Mao promised the peasants land reform and said that land would be redistributed, so that people didn't owe money to greedy landlords. Mao's revolution was undoubtedly inspired by other successful revolutions like the Russian Revolution of 1917. Finally, the final part of our acronym is S, social inequality. Under the nationalist government, the Chinese people had suffered. There was a huge divide between the people, economically speaking. A small percentage of people owned most of the wealth in the nation, while the majority of people lived in grinding poverty. Government officials under the nationalist regime were corrupt, and even soldiers in the nationalist army were poorly paid and suffered from low morale and hunger. Social inequality in China created a situation where people were willing to follow Mao, who promised a more egalitarian or equal society. So to summarize, how did the communists win? Genos. It was because of Genos. G-E-N-O-S. All revolutions display a pattern. In China, of course, the Chinese Revolution, no different. All right, well, let's talk now about some of the philosophies behind communism in China. These include Marxism and what we call Maoism. Mao's ideas were based on communist ideals shaped by Marxist philosophy. Karl Marx is given credit for coming up with the idea of communism. Communism is the most extreme type of socialism, remember? Marx argued that it was the workers, who he called the proletariat, who were the most important in society. Common workers, Marx argued, should be the driving force behind all societies. And that makes perfect sense on paper. Shouldn't the majority of people in society be making most of the decisions? Right. Well, it appears almost democratic on paper. Marx believed that if all workers of the world united together, they could overthrow the greedy capitalists who were self-interested, and then the world would become a better place. Marx's ideas were written down in a book called the Communist Manifesto. They were written in response to what Marx viewed as the evils associated with industrialization and capitalism, where people are self-interested and only interested in making a profit. If everyone would just work together, eventually there would be no more social classes in the world, and we'd all live together peacefully. And this is where I usually start singing Kumbaya. Anyway, Mao's interpretation of Marxism became known as Maoism. Mao adapted Marx's ideas, and he told the peasants that they needed to be the ones to carry out the revolution in China. Mao also saw how the Russian Revolution in 1917 had been successful, and he vowed to do the same in China. Well, Mao is going to create a new social order. On paper, China seemed to be democratic. Mao set up the National People's Congress and set up democratic principles like free elections. However, in reality, China had become a one-party dictatorship. In a true democracy, there are many different political parties. In China, all parties were under the Communist Party. Mao became the chairman of the Communist Party and hence the dictator of the People's Republic of China. When Mao took over in 1949, China had undergone much chaos and was a mess. The new government faced many challenges. Mao will establish a totalitarian state in order to reach his goals. So, how did Mao rule? Well, Mao's leadership can be characterized by the following. Mao operated a communist, totalitarian regime, and he used propaganda to convince his people of his ideals and to maintain order in society. A totalitarian state means that the government controls all aspects of people's lives. They determine what types of information people have access to, they determine what people are taught, and ultimately, people learn that the state, or the government, is more important than the individual in society. Mao wrote down many of his theories in a book which became called the Quotations from Chairman Mao. This was a little red book and was required reading for people. In fact, during the 1960s Cultural Revolution, people were required to carry it with them at all times. Mao's leadership depended on propaganda, like most totalitarian regimes. Propaganda is the spread of ideas to promote a cause or damage an opposing cause. Propaganda can include state-sponsored songs or music, inspirational posters or murals, as well as radio broadcasts, news reports, or enormous murals of a nation's leader to inspire people. Mao's face was everywhere in China. Mao is most well known for two main programs during his reign from 1949 to 1976. The first was the Great Leap Forward during the 1950s. Mao wanted to end foreign domination and make China self-sufficient under this program. His second program was intended to renew people's faith in communist ideals during the 1960s. This was called the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Both of these programs ended in failure, and we will discuss these in more depth shortly. Following Mao's death in 1976, a new leader took over in China. Deng Xiaoping instituted a number of reforms, resulting in change for China. Realizing that so many of Mao's goals had failed, Deng Xiaoping attempted to ease some of the totalitarian government policies. Under Deng Xiaoping, life became a little less totalitarian. For instance, Deng Xiaoping encouraged Chinese students to have contact with foreigners, and he encouraged cultural exchanges with other nations. He instituted policies in China that allowed for some private ownership in business. So instead of having the government control all aspects of the economy, people were allowed to compete in business on a limited basis. Essentially, Deng Xiaoping helped to initiate aspects of a mixed economic system, realizing that competition in the economy can spur change and lead to innovation and growth. All right, well, let's talk now about some of the other changes that happened under Deng Xiaoping, including the Tiananmen Square protests. With so many economic changes in China, many students were inspired to ask the government for further change, this time political ones. Some students asked for democratic reforms. In June of 1989, thousands of students gathered in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and demanded change from the government. Soon, almost 1 million people had gathered in the square. The government ordered them to return home. The students refused. In the middle of the night, the government ordered the military to clear the students out of the square. Infantry soldiers and tanks were sent in to clear out the square using force. Thousands were wounded or killed. No one knows the exact number. The student leaders who were responsible for the planning of the event were arrested, often tortured, and thrown in prison. Many of these students were executed, and many of them remain in prison even today. The Chinese do not acknowledge that any of this ever happened. In fact, if you search on the internet in China for the Tiananmen Square massacre or all the events surrounding the event, instead of seeing the actual event that took place, you're going to see smiling images of tourists in Tiananmen Square. See, students are not taught of this event in school, and most are unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that it ever took place. The Chinese government has worked closely with information giants like Google and Cisco and used the technology to hide all of this information from their people. And this has prompted international outrage that these tech companies are allowing, essentially, censorship. Do tech companies have an obligation to the people of the world for the free flow of information? You know, these are just some of the fundamental philosophical questions raised by all of this today. And we will learn more about this when we begin watching the Frontline documentary called Tank Man. The Tiananmen Square incident in 1989, also called the Beijing Massacre, is a significant event in history. It clearly shows that although China made many economic changes in the years following Mao's death in terms of the economy, it shows that the Chinese were not ready for political change that could possibly threaten their government's totalitarian reign on the flow of information and ideas in society. As information becomes more and more accessible with the emergence of smartphones and social media, it will be more and more difficult for any totalitarian society anywhere in the world to maintain complete control over their people. Okay, well, the second part, or the final part, I guess, of this lecture today is to briefly explain the economic developments that China has gone through over time, as well as give you a more in-depth look at the Cultural Revolution under Mao. This should help you better comprehend the People's Century Great Leap 1949 documentary that we watched in class. Remember? All right, economic development. So we know that Mao Zedong established a communist totalitarian regime in 1949. He eliminated all private businesses. Instead, a command economy was established. The state was in charge of what to produce, how to produce things, and how much to produce and charge for items. Under a command economy, the government has total control of the economy and all businesses. We know that after Mao died in 1976, the new leader, Deng Xiaoping, is going to ease up on the economy and introduce reforms. These reforms will lead to China having a mixed economy today with strict government regulation. The United States also has a mixed economy. However, most countries of the world today do have mixed economies. Each government in each of these places, they decide how much of the economy to regulate. The Chinese regulate their economy far more than we do here in the States. All right, well, let's get back to Mao briefly. First of all, we're going to talk about Mao's revolutionary goals. Mao had three main goals for China. The first was promising a better life for the poor. The second goal was developing the economy and making China an economic superpower. And finally, his third goal was to make China a major political force in the world, comparable to the United States and the then Soviet Union. Mao faced numerous challenges following the Communist Revolution in 1949. See, China was far behind the industrialized world. It was a relatively poor nation, and it certainly didn't help that the nationalists fled to Taiwan with much of the nation's wealth or gold supply. Without capital or money to invest, China faced an uphill battle. Mao's answer to this was communist totalitarianism. Mao's first step was to reorganize the nation's agricultural system. All right, so he reorganized agriculture. How? Under a communist totalitarian system, the government owns all land. There is no private property. Mao took over the land from wealthy landowners and redistributed it to poorer people. He then set up large state-run farms in order to produce the amount of food required to support China's population. On these collective farms, people pooled their resources and shared tools. Collective farms had been set up in the Soviet Union for food production under Joseph Stalin. Well, Mao's goal was to not only create enough food for the Chinese, but to produce enough food to sell abroad as well for profit. The collectivization of agriculture took on a new form in China. Mao transformed these collective farms into large communities of people called communes. Each of these communes included several villages. Each commune competed against other communes to meet and surpass quotas set by the government for food production. Communes were also used for industrial production, the building of roads, the making of steel, the building of canal systems, like the Great Canal we saw being built in the documentary. Oops, you heard the bell in the background there, sorry. Anyway, what were some of the effects of Mao's Great Leap Forward? We learned from the People's Century video that this commune farm and industrial program did not work and ended up with a massive famine that the government tried to hide. Millions of people starved to death. Adding insult to injury, many workers were not motivated to work under these new conditions, and natural disasters like floods and earthquakes presented further challenges. The Great Leap Forward is regarded in history as more of a great leap backward. Epic fail. Mao was forced to focus on smaller industrial and agricultural goals for his nation. Well, that brings us to the Chinese Cultural Revolution. In 1966, Mao launched the Chinese Communist Revolution in order to renew people's faith in his communist totalitarian society. People had become disillusioned following the failure of the Great Leap Forward, and Mao's regime was crumbling. The Chinese Communist Revolution is also referred to as the Chinese Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Remember, proletariat is a word that means worker and is typically used when describing workers in a communist system. Mao renewed people's faith in communism by launching a wide-scale attack on capitalism. Capitalism is often used to describe, or it's a word rather, for free market economy, like the economy of the United States. Although many people say we're capitalist here in the US or have a free market, we actually have more of a mixed economy, leaning towards capitalism or a free market. So just make a note of that or be aware of that. Under a purely capitalist economy, the means of production are controlled entirely by private owners, and these individuals are operating for profit. Mao's attack on capitalism included a call for young people to root out greedy people in society who weren't towing the company line. Students and young factory workers formed a secret police known as the Red Guard. They were given the task to root out corruption amongst government officials and in schools. What ensued was terrifying for many people in China. Many people were falsely accused, and as the Red Guard searched for the non-believers, many people were killed. Foreign influences were shunned, churches were destroyed and deemed as an affront against communism. Students carried out attacks against professors, teachers, government officials. These attacks were broadcast on television as propaganda. People were required to carry Mao's Book of Quotations, also called the Little Red Book, as a symbol of their devotion to communist ideals. In public meetings, guilty people were forced to confess their sins against the state. So what were the effects? Well, people were tortured, imprisoned, or sent to state-sponsored forced labor camps. It was a scary time in China and resulted in an entire generation of kids who were separated from their families emotionally. Instead of renewing faith in communism, the Cultural Revolution failed. People distrusted Mao, and the government's legitimacy was questioned. Mao died in 1976, and a struggle for power ensued in China. The former communist officials who were pro-Mao, which included a group of people like Mao's widow or wife, and they were called the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four tried to gain power after Mao's death and continue Mao's cultural revolutionary or revolution policies. Moderate and liberal leaders within the Communist Party refused to let this happen, and working together, the moderates and liberals arrested the Gang of Four and put them on trial. This paved the way for new leadership in China, led by a man who I mentioned earlier named Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese government tried to distance themselves from Mao's economic and cultural policies. This is going to result in a period of time influenced by the four modernizations. As I mentioned earlier in my lecture, Xiaoping changed China's economy. These changes under Xiaoping became known as the four modernizations. Under this plan, Xiaoping called for 1. Modernization of agriculture, 2. The expansion of industry, 3. The development of science and technology, and finally, 4. Upgrading China's defense or military. The four modernizations under Deng Xiaoping helped develop industry in China by privatizing parts of the economy to spur economic development and innovation. Free market reforms were made to inspire competition in society and focus on consumer products. Under this system, China quickly became a world leader in industrial production and trade. China is predicted to have the second largest economy in the world by 2022 because of many of these reforms. This expansion of trade and industry will eventually lead to people demanding political change as well. There's that bell again, sorry. The expansion of trade outside of China now includes SPZs, or Special Economic Zones, in southeastern China. Free enterprise is permitted in these places. With the return of Hong Kong to China in 1997, industrial output and economic growth has flourished. A changing economy in China from a communist to a mixed economy has created changing patterns of life for most of the Chinese. People in China live very differently today than they ever did under Mao Zedong. All right, well, thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon. Bye.